Alicia Fitzgerald, political correspondent, is with us, back to talk through some of the big ones. I tell you what, Alicia, I mean, you've been covering politics for about 150 years now, as I recall, and, you know, we're only 13, 14 days into 2025. The agenda doesn't stop giving at the moment.
No, it really doesn't. And I think so many people thought, oh, after Labour get elected, it's all going to be really boring. We've had a crazy few years politically, you know, whether that's from Partygate to Liz Truss to everything in between. You can definitely say it's not been dull. And I think loads of people thought, oh, well, after this, it will all settle down and nothing will ever be as spicy again. But we were fooled. It is, and it's still happening.
Indeed. And this story today, Reform, you know, hitting 24%, behind Labour and in front of the Tories. Look, people will say polls, schmoles. You know, it's just you know, 2,000 odd people who were surveyed. I know the amount of people isn't always the key factor of authenticity in a poll. There are other sort of measures that are thrown in as well. But nonetheless, it's either equally as fair or unfair to all parties. It puts them ahead of the Tories and literally biting at the heels of Labour. For a party that has 5 members of Parliament, I mean, whatever way you dress this one, regardless of how somebody votes, that is a significant story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's pretty unheard of for a party of that size to have that much traction in a poll. And YouGov is one of the bigger polling companies as well. They do these polls quite a lot. And often people think that the bigger polling companies favour the bigger parties just because of the traditional methods that they use. But I mean, this just proves that there is the Labour vote that was so high at the election has just split massively in loads of places. I mean, loads of people who voted Labour at the election now voting for Reform, which is quite astonishing when you think about what Labour's typical ideology is and their main policies versus Reform UK's policies. I mean, they're very different. So it's so interesting that in just 6 months, there have been people who voted for a set of policies that are so different to Reform's and are now going away.
And that's the bit that I didn't understand it when it was the other way round, when lots of Conservatives clearly voted for Labour at the last election and crossed the Rubicon. I could understand if they voted Reform. I know many did, and I could understand if they abstained altogether. But clearly, much of that success that Keir Starmer had was because people decided, well, I'm going to give it a go. So maybe we're in a sort of different era. We don't perhaps define parties in the same kind of ideological way that we once did. But it's fair to say, I suppose, that there's no doubt about it when it comes to ideology. We can all identify reforms. Some might struggle to identify the beating heart of what Labour now stands for, and many would be completely out of ideas to point to what conservatism is these days.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. And I think an issue that we're seeing is just people losing faith in the establishment overall, in things that are tried and tested. And that's why I think this growth in Reform has been so large and so fast. It's because people say, right, we tried the Tories for 14 years. That was a disaster. We then said, right, let's bring Labour back. You know, the Blair years, they weren't so bad. Maybe it will just be like that. And then people are kind of saying, God, nothing has changed for me. I still can't afford my heating bill. I can't afford my groceries. Yeah, I can't get a doctor's appointment. All these things that really matters to people. People just need that change to happen faster than maybe it's doing now, and they don't have the patience. So I think they're now turning to smaller parties that aren't tried and tested, that actually there is no evidence of whether any of these parties will achieve what they achieve, but people are willing more to take a chance on them because they think, why not? What have I got to lose?
Do you think, would Keir Starmer take this seriously? Would Kemi Badenoch take this seriously?
Well, I mean, I think, if anything, I think Kemi Badenoch's the person that should be taking this the most seriously of anyone. I mean, I think if this poll shows anything other than the massive growth of Reform, it just shows that people are still totally not interested in the Tories. I mean, since the election, I think lots of people thought that post-election, Labour would come in and then people say, oh, no, actually, I'm going to go back to the Tories. This is worse. But it just shows that people are so put off by the last 14 years of their governing that is still not an appealing choice for people. So I think Kemi Badenoch really ought to take this seriously. And I know she always says, oh, Reform isn't a threat to me. You know, this is not actually an issue. But I think deep down, the people in the Tory top team, they are worried and they do know that actually this is a big deal, and if it keeps growing in the speed it is by the next election, it could be huge for the Tories.
But as you know, Alicia, from covering this and speaking to the various people inside the parties, there's a whole lot of Conservatives that wouldn't go near reform. Those One Nationers pathologically loathe the idea of this reform outfit. I don't think it's just because they, somebody is sort of raining on their parade and, new kids in town coming over here. Who do they think they are? Ideologically, they feel this is not what conservatism is.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason for the collapse in the Conservative Party brand. It's this lack of understanding their identity, because on the one hand, you have Conservatives, the ones that you mentioned, who call themselves the One Nationers. They are slightly more liberal, say, than people towards the right of the party, who maybe identify a bit more with reform. So you actually kind of have two very different sets of people all trying to sit under the same umbrella. And that's pretty much what happened before the election. It was basically the Tory party became two different things. It became people who think that the party's gone too right-wing, and then people who think the party's gone too left-wing. So actually, that just kind of broke it in half, and that hasn't really repaired. It still is like that. There's still people who want it to go further right to try and battle reform, and there's still people who want to stay far away from that kind of policy and actually try and steal back the left-wing votes from Labour. So that just hasn't been rectified at all by the party. Well,
of course, Conservative lost more votes to other parties than Reform, so I suppose they will kind of keep that in mind when they're, crunching the numbers. At least you hope they would. Let's move to this story. Move over Liz Truss. There's a new lettuce in town, Alicia. We all remember the headlines of Liz Truss being portrayed as a lettuce because, well, a lettuce lasted longer than Liz Truss did, 44 days in office, and now those comparisons are being made by one newspaper over Rachel Reeves. She says she's, determined to fight. She's back from China. She was just in the House just an hour or so ago, giving a speech on her trip to China and taking questions as well. She said the UK will go further and faster in pursuit of growth. That's her pledge, but can she achieve this?
I mean, I think this is an interesting story, because at the kind of crux of it was a really bad comms moment from Labour and from Keir Starmer. He was asked whether or not Rachel Reeves would be his Chancellor at the end of this Parliament, so in 4 or 5 years' time. And instead of saying either yes or no, he refused to explicitly say that, but just said he has loads of confidence in Rachel Reeves and she's a very good Chancellor. That, of course, if he refused to say yes, what the newspapers are going to do is say that Keir Starmer has refused to say that she will be his Chancellor, which kind of implies that she won't. So that kind of got out there. There was time for that story to run. He then came back a few hours later, after the story being everywhere, and said, oh, no, actually, she definitely will be my Chancellor till the end. But what he's done now is pigeonholed himself into a really awkward thing, because it's actually quite rare to have the same Chancellor from the start of a Parliament to the end. It's not always a reflection on them being bad. It just does. There's often a bit of churn and a changeover and a reshuffle. He's now vowed that she's going to be there till the end. There's a high chance that she won't be there till the end, whether that's because of her performance or just from the natural reshuffles and churns that happen. And now it's going to look like he's made a U-turn, so not the best comms from...
Not at all. I mean, that was extraordinary. I thought the U-turn made it just worse, really. I mean, it was a bit odd when he just couldn't unequivocally say yes. When he'd previously been asked about David Lammy, and he was able to say yes. But then to come back and go, oh, no, that thing we said earlier, right? We didn't mean that thing. We mean this thing instead. This is what we mean, actually. We've got Rachel's back. And if I was Rachel Reeves, I would feel anything but convinced by that second response to the question. Starmer under pressure as Labour Rotherham MP backs national grooming inquiry. This is Sarah Champion, of course, who's been very vocal in this area over a number of years, often shouted down from people on her own side, people in her own local constituency as well. She's called for a national inquiry into grooming gang failures. She demands demands contrast, of course, with previous stance supported by Rochdale MP Paul Waugh and others. So she's marking herself out here. I don't think she's going to get a front bench position anytime soon.
No, probably not. But do you know what? I think that all political parties, and especially governing parties, do need some figures like Sarah Champion. It's really important to have a mix of opinion and people who are not afraid to speak out maybe against the government line, regardless of the topic. I think that's kind of what keeps governments held to account in a way, and just make sure that they don't live in this slight echo chamber that can just be caused slightly out of fear. I think lots of backbenchers are sometimes too scared maybe to actually challenge what their party leader says, especially this current Labour intake. I think we've really noticed it. Lots of them, I don't want to generalise too much, but lots of them, this is their first job in politics. Lots of them are super young. And I think there is a little bit of fear sometimes amongst those backbenchers of actually standing up and saying, do you know what, front bench, do you know what, government, I don't actually agree with this. So I think it's important to have that balance, and it's good that she's remained true to herself, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely right. It's that kind of passion we want to see, and consistency we want to see in politicians, and there it is in action. Listen, Alicia, thank you as ever. Alicia Fitzgerald, a political commentator with us.